The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in February of 1949, delivered by hand to the small office above the laundromat on 125th Street where Bumpy Johnson kept his accounts. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 7 names written in a careful hand, and beneath each name a number. The numbers were specific, not rounded figures but exact amounts. The kind of specificity that comes from someone who kept records rather than estimates. Beside the 7th name, at the bottom of the page, a single additional line: "They thought nobody was watching." Bumpy read the letter twice. Then he folded it precisely along its original creases, placed it in the center drawer of his desk, and sat for a long time looking at the wall. The 7 names on that letter were the names of men he knew. Not intimately, some of them were names he recognized more than faces he could place, but known in the way that a man who has spent 20 years building something knows the people who move through the edges of what he's built. Men who had, at various points, received something from the fund. Men whose families had been helped by it, or whose neighbors had. Men who understood what the fund was and what it meant, which made what the letter was telling him considerably worse than if they had been strangers. The fund had no official name. Harlem called it different things in different neighborhoods. The relief money, the Johnson account, Bumpy's fund. And none of these names had ever appeared on any document that could be examined by anyone with a reason to examine it. What it was, in practice, was a systematically organized distribution of money from Bumpy's organization to the people of Harlem, who needed it in ways that the city's official welfare systems had been specifically designed to overlook. Rent that was 3 weeks past due. Medical bills that had accumulated past the point where any realistic payment schedule made sense. School supplies, winter coats, the particular category of urgent, small expenses that separated a family managing from a family in crisis. What made it different from charity, at least in the way Bumpy understood it, was that it operated without the particular humiliation that official charity required. The forms, the interviews, the requirement to explain yourself to someone who had the power to decide whether your need was genuine enough to warrant assistance. The fund reached people through the community's own networks, through the churches and the barbers and the women who ran the block associations, and the men who worked the loading docks and knew which families on their street were struggling in ways that weren't visible from the outside. It reached them quietly, through intermediaries who knew them and who knew the fund. And the money arrived without paperwork and without questions about whether it would be spent correctly, because the people who ran the fund had made a decision, early and permanently, that the dignity of the recipient was more important than the accounting precision of the distribution. Bumpy had been running it in various forms. Since 1938, it had started simply a stack of envelopes distributed through the churches on Sunday. Unremarkable in its origins, the kind of thing that many men of means in Harlem did in smaller ways. What made it different from those smaller efforts was the infrastructure that had developed around it over the following decade. The network of people who identified need and the system by which money moved from Bumpy's organization to the people who needed it without the transaction being visible to anyone with an interest in stopping it. By 1949, the fund was moving approximately $40,000 a year through Harlem, not in large amounts. Most individual disbursements were under $200, and many were under $50, but consistently, reliably, in a way that people had come to depend on without fully understanding where the dependability came from. Families who had been through difficult seasons knew, without being told explicitly, that a certain kind of help existed and that it could be found through certain people who knew how to find it. This knowledge was itself a form of security separate from the money. A sense that the neighborhood contained something protective that official institutions had never provided. The 7 men on the letter had understood this system well enough to steal from it. Not all at once, and not in the same way. The letter made clear, through its specific figures, that the theft had happened over a period of approximately 18 months. Through a combination of methods that suggested the 7 men had not necessarily coordinated with each other, but had independently recognized the same vulnerability in how the money moved between its collection and its distribution. At certain points in the chain, there were human hands through which envelopes passed, and human hands could redirect an envelope before it reached its destination. And in a system that operated without the kind of documentation that would have attracted unwanted attention, redirection was difficult to detect. The amounts were not enormous by themselves. The largest single figure beside any name on the letter was $460. The smallest was $90. But the letter contained totals as well as individual figures, and the totals told a story about what 18 months of systematic small theft looked like when it was assembled in one place, which was a number just over $2,800, taken from envelopes that had been intended for families who had already needed it enough to ask. Bumpy spent 3 days with the letter before he did anything with it. 3 days was his usual period for letting a situation clarify itself, not because he was indecisive, but because he had learned over many years that the first response to something that made him angry was almost always a worse response than the one that arrived after the anger had been fully examined. The anger was real. It was the particular kind that came not from personal offense, but from something colder and more durable. The specific contempt of a man who understood what trust required and had watched 7 people take advantage of the trust of the most vulnerable people in his community. On the 4th day, he called a man named Solomon Webb into the office. Solomon Webb was 63 years old, had lived in Harlem since 1907, and had for the preceding 20 years served an unofficial function in Bumpy's organization that had no formal title and required no formal relationship. He was, in the simplest description, the person who knew everything about everyone in a 40-block radius, not through surveillance or intelligence gathering, but through the particular omniscience that accumulates in a man who has lived in the same neighborhood for 4 decades, raised his children there, buried his wife there, and paid such sustained and genuine attention to his surroundings that Harlem had simply made him the repository of its memory. He knew which families had been in the neighborhood since the 20s and which had arrived last year. He knew who had stopped speaking to whom and why. He knew which church a man attended and whether he attended regularly or only when he needed something. And he knew what that distinction meant about the man's character. He had the specific gift of a person who listens more than he speaks, which in Harlem, as in most places, made him considerably more valuable than the people who spoke more than they listened. Bumpy showed him the letter. Solomon read it without rushing, the way older men read things that matter. Then he set it down and looked at Bumpy with the expression of a man who is not surprised by the information and is not pretending to be surprised. "I had heard some things," Solomon said. Bumpy asked what things. Solomon told him, not everything on the letter. He didn't have the specific figures, but the shape of it. He had heard from 2 separate people who told him independently and who didn't know each other well, that certain envelopes had been moving oddly. He hadn't been certain enough to bring it to Bumpy's attention without more to support it, and then the letter had arrived before he had decided what to do. Bumpy asked about each of the 7 names. For each one, Solomon had something, not evidence exactly, but the kind of contextual information that told a more complete story about who a person was and why they might have made the choice they made. Some of it was straightforward: financial difficulty, family pressure, the familiar arithmetic of a man who has looked at what he owes and what he earns and found the numbers impossible. Some of it was more complicated. One of the 7 was a man who had convinced himself. Solomon believed that what he was doing was a form of lending rather than theft, that he intended to repay it and was simply borrowing against an account he had no claim on. 2 of them Solomon described as men who had never had any particular orientation toward honesty, or its absence, and who had simply encountered an opportunity and taken it. And the 7th, Solomon said, pausing in a way that indicated something more significant was coming. The 7th was a man named Arthur Gaines, and Arthur Gaines was different from the others in a specific way that Solomon described carefully. Gaines had, at various points over the preceding 3 years, been one of the people through whom the fund operated, not handling money himself, but connected to the network in a way that had given him visibility into how it worked and where its vulnerabilities were. He had, according to Solomon's account, been trusted with the kind of information about the fund's operations that was shared only with people whose reliability was considered established. Bumpy said nothing for a moment after Solomon finished describing Gaines. The silence had a particular quality that Solomon recognized, and that most people who knew Bumpy recognized. It was not the silence of someone thinking about what to do, but of someone who had already decided, and was examining the decision to make sure it was right. Then he asked Solomon a question. He asked whether, in Solomon's assessment, any of the 7 men were beyond the reach of understanding what they had done. Solomon considered this carefully. Then he said he didn't think so. He said he thought 6 of them were men who had made a bad decision and knew it was a bad decision, and that the knowledge of what they had done was probably already working on them in ways that wouldn't show from the outside but were real nonetheless. And he said that Gaines was the one he wasn't certain about, because Gaines had the specific quality of a man who was good at explaining things to himself in ways that made the explanation feel true, and that this quality could make a man very difficult to reach. Bumpy thanked Solomon and sent him home. Then he sat alone in the office until the afternoon light left the window and the laundromat below closed for the evening, thinking through what came next with the same methodical patience he brought to everything that required precision. What came next was not violence. This was not because violence was unavailable to him. It was because violence was the response that cost the most and produced the least in situations like this one. 7 men were going to be made to understand something, and the understanding was more important than the punishment. An understanding required a particular kind of conversation that violence terminated rather than facilitated. He began the following Monday. He did not see all 7 men in the same week or arrange them in any particular order of severity. He scheduled them the way a careful doctor schedules patients, with enough time between appointments that each conversation could be fully complete before the next one began, and with attention to the specific nature of each situation so that the approach could be calibrated to the person rather than applied uniformly. He had prepared for each conversation separately, because each man was a separate situation and a uniform approach would have been a shortcut that the situation did not deserve. He had spent the week before the first meeting reviewing what Solomon had told him about each of the 7 men, adding it to what the letter already told him, and arriving at a picture of each that was specific enough to address rather than generic enough to simply confront. He understood that the purpose of the conversations was not to demonstrate that he knew what had happened, that would be established simply by the fact of the conversation, but to make each man understand something that he might not have fully understood before, which was the specific human cost of what he had done. The money could be restored. The understanding was harder to produce and more important to achieve. The first man he spoke to was named Calvin Duke, and the conversation with Calvin Duke established the template for all the conversations that followed. Not because Bumpy had designed it that way, but because Calvin Duke's response to what Bumpy said was so precisely what Bumpy had expected that it clarified, in retrospect, what the conversations needed to accomplish. Calvin Duke was brought to the office by two of Bumpy's men, not roughly, not with any physical intimidation, but with the specific gravity of a summons that communicates its own seriousness. He sat across the desk from Bumpy in the chair that visitors sat in, and Bumpy looked at him for a moment before speaking. And what Calvin Duke saw in that look made him begin to speak first, which is what Bumpy had been waiting for. What Calvin Duke said, in a rush of words that collapsed over each other in their urgency to be heard, was essentially a confession and an explanation offered simultaneously. The way people speak when they have been living with something difficult and suddenly have the chance to put it outside themselves. He told Bumpy what he had done, though Bumpy already knew. He told him why, which Bumpy mostly already knew as well, a debt to a man outside the neighborhood, a threat that had felt pressing and immediate, a decision made in a moment when the decision felt like the only available one, and then extended into a pattern because the pattern was already established. He was not, as he spoke, performing remorse for an audience. He was working through something in real time, the specific work of a man who has been carrying guilt in a private place, and is now being asked to bring it into a room and look at it with someone else present. This was harder than it sounded, and Bumpy gave him the time it required without rushing it. Bumpy listened to all of it. When Calvin Duke was finished, the office was quiet for a moment. Then Bumpy said something that Calvin Duke would repeat, verbatim, for the rest of his life, to anyone who asked him about this period. He said, "The money you took didn't belong to me. I want you to understand that clearly before we discuss anything else. It belonged to the families it was meant for. It belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Watkins on 131st Street, whose landlord had given her until the end of the month. It belonged to the Patterson children, who needed winter coats, and whose mother didn't know how she was going to manage it. It belonged to people who had nowhere else to go and who had trusted that something existed in this community that would catch them when they fell. That's whose money you took." Calvin Duke said nothing. There was nothing to say. Bumpy continued. He said that the debt was therefore not to him. It was to the community that the fund served, and the community was owed something more than the original amount, because the families who had been intended to receive help during those 18 months had not received it, and the absence of help had consequences that money after the fact could partially address but not fully repair. He named specific families. Not to humiliate Calvin Duke. Humiliation was not the purpose, but because the specific names were what made the abstract cost concrete, and concrete was the only form in which this kind of understanding fully arrived. He told Calvin Duke what he owed. The amount was twice what the letter had indicated he had taken, not an arbitrary multiple. Bumpy had calculated what each man owed based on the specific amounts they had redirected and a figure he had assigned to the consequence cost, the value of the help that had not arrived when it had been needed. The number was not punitive in the way of a fine designed to deter. It was restorative in the way of an accounting designed to make whole. He told Calvin Duke how it would be paid, not in a lump sum, because most of the men on the list could not produce that amount at once, but in a structured schedule that Bumpy and Solomon Webb had worked out based on what each man's circumstances could realistically support. The schedule was specific, with amounts and dates, and there was a mechanism, Solomon Webb as the intermediary through which payments would be received and verified. And he told Calvin Duke one more thing. He told him that the matter would not leave this room, that no one outside the people already involved would know what had happened, provided the payment schedule was honored. This was not offered as charity. It was offered as the recognition that a man who has done something wrong has, in most cases, the capacity to do something right afterward, and that the capacity to do something right is most available when the wrong has been acknowledged rather than exposed. Calvin Duke left the office 40 minutes after he arrived. He made his first payment to Solomon Webb 11 days later, on the exact date that had been agreed. The other 5 conversations, the 5 men who were not Arthur Gaines, followed variations on the same pattern, because the men themselves were variations on the same essential situation. Different specifics, different immediate causes for what they had done, different degrees of self-awareness about the wrongness of it. But in each case, the conversation produced the same result: an acknowledgement, an accounting, a schedule, and a man who left the office carrying something heavier than he had arrived with, but also, in most cases, something that felt more like relief than burden, because the weight of what he had been carrying alone was in some ways harder to bear than the weight of what he had now been asked to carry with knowledge and accountability. The one exception, to varying degrees, was a man named Patrick Coleman, who arrived at the office with the specific defensiveness of someone who had spent time preparing arguments. He had explanations that were careful and layered, and each explanation was offered with the energy of a man who believed that if he could only find the right framing, the situation would resolve in his favor. Bumpy listened to all of it without interrupting, which was his consistent practice, and when Coleman finished, he said only that he had not asked for an explanation and that the letter did not require one. He told Coleman what he owed and how it would be paid and what would happen if it wasn't. And Coleman left the office having said considerably more than any of the others and understood considerably less. He made his payments nonetheless. The schedule was its own form of understanding. The 7th conversation was the one with Arthur Gaines, and it was different from all the others in the way that Solomon Webb had predicted it would be. Gaines arrived without the nervous energy that characterized most of the other men's arrivals. He sat down with the ease of someone who has prepared himself for a performance and believes in his own preparation. He was 61 years old, had lived in Harlem all his life, and had the particular smoothness of a man who had spent decades presenting himself favorably to people who had the power to judge him. He wore a good suit and a measured expression, and he arranged himself in the visitor's chair with the settled deliberateness of a man conducting a meeting rather than attending one. Bumpy let him begin, which was his consistent practice, and Gaines began with something that none of the other 6 had attempted, which was an immediate redirection of the conversation away from what had happened and toward what Gaines framed as a misunderstanding about how the fund worked and the nature of the transactions in question. It was a well-constructed argument, and it had the specific quality of arguments that are made by people who are genuinely skilled at argument. It was not obviously false. It exploited genuine ambiguities in how the fund operated, and it invited a response that would have required Bumpy to defend the fund's operational details rather than simply state what had happened. Gaines had. Bumpy understood, listening to him, spent considerably more time preparing for this conversation than any of the other 6 men had. The preparation itself was a form of information about who Gaines was and how he had been living with what he had done, which was not with guilt but with the construction of a justification sufficiently elaborate to feel true. Bumpy did not take the invitation. He let Gaines finish. Then he placed the letter on the desk between them, with Gaines's name and figure visible at the top of the page, and he asked Gaines a single question. He asked whether Gaines believed that the family who should have received the envelope that he had redirected in March of 1947 had been adequately served by what actually happened to that money. Gaines looked at the letter. Then he looked at Bumpy. The performance quality in his manner shifted slightly, not disappeared, but recalibrated. The way a practiced man's performance recalibrates when he realizes that the audience is not responding to the version he prepared. He had expected a different kind of confrontation. He had expected the confrontation that matched his prepared response. And what he was receiving instead was something that bypassed his preparation entirely by refusing to engage with it. He said that circumstances were complicated. Bumpy said he understood that circumstances were complicated, and that this was not a conversation about circumstances. It was a conversation about a family that had needed help and had not received it because of a decision Gaines had made, and about what Gaines owed them. He repeated the question: had the family been adequately served? Gaines was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the smoothness had fractured slightly at its edges. The way a surface fractures when the pressure applied to it exceeds what the surface was designed to withstand. He said that he had not thought of it in those terms. Bumpy said that he understood, and that this was exactly why they were having the conversation. What followed over the next 2 hours was the gradual, painful process of a man dismantling justifications that he had built carefully and that he had believed in, at least in part, because believing in them had been necessary for him to live comfortably with what he had done. Bumpy did not attack the justifications directly. Attacking them would have produced defense rather than understanding. He simply kept returning to the specific families, the specific envelopes, the specific months during which help had not arrived, and asking Gaines to account for each one in terms that his justifications could not cover. It was slow work, and it required patience that most people would have exhausted before it was finished. And by the time it was done, the room had a different quality than it had at the start of the conversation. Gaines agreed to the terms. His payment schedule was the same in structure, and, because his was the largest figure on the letter, larger in amount, he made his first payment to Solomon Webb 9 days later, 2 days before the agreed date, which Bumpy noted as the specific kind of overcompensation that a man produces when the discomfort of the original situation has been acute enough to make punctuality feel like partial relief. The payments were collected over the following 14 months. All 7 men honored their schedules, some more punctually than others, all of them complete by the end. Solomon Webb received each payment and recorded it in a notebook that he kept in the inside pocket of his coat and showed to no one except Bumpy. And as the amounts accumulated, the total grew past the original figure on the letter and past the doubled figure that had been calculated and eventually completed itself at a number that represented Bumpy and Solomon agreed. A reasonable approximation of what the restoration actually required. The money was returned to the fund and distributed over the following months in the same way that the fund had always worked. Through the network of people who identified need and the system that moved money without creating records that attracted attention. Some of it reached the specific families who had been intended to receive help during the 18 months of the theft. Some of those families were no longer in the circumstances that had originally made them need it, because circumstances changed over 18 months whether or not help arrived, and so the money went to the current circumstances rather than the past ones. What was not restored by money was something that Bumpy had factored into the accounting from the beginning. The 18 months during which help had not arrived were 18 months in which the families who needed it had managed without it, through whatever combination of alternatives they had been able to find, and that management had cost them things that money paid later could not. Repay the specific weight of those months, The decisions made under the pressure of need that wouldn't have been necessary if the help had come when it was supposed to. This was the part of the cost that the doubled repayment was meant to acknowledge rather than repair. A recognition that some debts accumulate interest in forms that have nothing to do with money. Word spread through Harlem the way things spread in Harlem, when they carry moral weight, not as an announcement. Not in newspapers, but in conversations between people who trusted each other and who understood what the information meant. It spread in the specific form of things that people tell each other when they want the telling to change something, and what it changed. Over the course of the following year, was the understanding within the network that ran the fund of what the fund was and what it required of the people who touched it. No one who handled money through the fund after 1949 did so without understanding, as a practical fact rather than an abstract principle, that the money had been through something and had been made whole by a process that was specific and serious, and that had required 7 men to reckon with something they would have preferred to avoid. This understanding was itself a form of protection for the fund, because it made the vulnerability that the 7 men had exploited into a visible vulnerability, one that the system could now defend against precisely because it had been used and dressed rather than simply trusted to remain invisible. Solomon Webb kept a notebook with the payment records until he died. In 1957, at some point in the years before his death, he had added a final entry at the back, not another payment record, but a short notation in his careful handwriting, the kind of summary a man writes when he is organizing something for preservation rather than use. It said that the fund had been made whole, that the making whole had required 14 months, and the cooperation of 7 men who had not initially appeared cooperative, and that, in his view, the fund was in a stronger position after what had happened than it had been before, not despite the theft, but because of what the response to it had required. He was right about this, and Bumpy knew he was right about it, and the knowing was a different kind of knowledge than the anger that had arrived with the envelope on a Thursday morning in February. The anger had been real and necessary. It had provided the energy required to address something that deserved to be addressed. But the knowledge that came afterward, the knowledge that a system tested and repaired is more durable than a system simply trusted, was what remained when the anger had done its work and the work was finished. The 7 men lived the rest of their lives in Harlem, most of them. Calvin Duke raised 3 children in the neighborhood and was known, in his later years, as a man who was reliably present when community needs arose at meetings, at functions, in the background of things that required someone to show up and do something without requiring credit for it. This was not coincidental. Patrick Coleman moved away in the early 1950s, which some people read as avoidance, and others read as simply the ordinary movement of a man's life taking him elsewhere. Arthur Gaines stayed, and in the years after 1949, he was quieter than he had been before, which people attributed to age, and which was probably also something else. None of them ever spoke publicly about what had happened. This was not something Bumpy had required of them. It was simply the outcome of men who had been through something that they preferred to have behind them rather than in front of them. The silence was its own form of the lesson having been learned. Bumpy himself never mentioned it in any conversation that was recorded or that the people who knew him passed on as a story worth telling. It remained, in the public record of his life, simply a period in which the fund continued to operate in 7. Men made a series of payments to Solomon Webb without anyone outside the immediate situation understanding why. This invisibility was not accidental. It was the outcome Bumpy had designed for. The recognition that the purpose of what had happened was restoration rather than example, and that restoration does not require an audience to be complete. What Harlem knew, without knowing the specifics, was that something had happened and that it had been addressed and that the fund continued. This was what mattered, and it was communicated through the continuation itself, through the envelopes that kept arriving at the right times and the help that kept reaching the people who needed it. Quietly, without ceremony, the way important things work when they are working properly. The envelope that had started everything, the single sheet of paper with 7 names and 7 figures, and the line at the bottom that said they thought nobody was watching, remained in the center drawer of Bumpy's desk for the rest of his life. He did not keep it as a reminder of what the 7 men had done. He kept it as a reminder of the person who had watched and had chosen to tell him, whose name was not on the letter and whose identity he had never determined despite a genuine effort to find out. Someone in Harlem had seen what was happening to the fund and had found a way to make sure it was addressed. That person had asked for nothing in return, had not signed their name, and had trusted that the information would reach the right hands and produce the right result. This was, Bumpy thought, the most complete expression of what the fund was supposed to be about, which was the idea that a community took care of itself through the accumulated decisions of its members to notice things and to act on what they noticed in ways that served the whole. The letter had been one such act. The 14 months of collected payments had been 7 more, each one a man choosing, under circumstances he had created for himself, to make something right that he had made wrong. That was enough. In Bumpy Johnson's accounting, which was particular about what counted as enough and what didn't, that was precisely enough. The letter had started with 7 names and ended with a line that said they thought nobody was watching. This line had told Bumpy something important about whoever had sent it, not just that they had seen what was happening, but that they understood the psychology of what had made the theft possible. The 7 men had stolen because they believed the system was unwatched in the specific places where they had touched it. The anonymous letter was a correction of that belief, delivered in a form that allowed the correction to be acted upon without becoming a source of new complications. Bumpy had thought about this for many years after 1949, in the particular way that a man thinks about something that has taught him something important without requiring him to be harmed by the teaching. The fund had survived not because it was perfect, but because it had been watched, and the watching had been done by someone who had no official role and had not been asked to do it. This was the most honest description of how communities actually worked, not through institutions and official structures, but through the accumulated attention of people who noticed things and cared enough to do something with what they noticed, even when doing something required trust that had no guarantee attached to it. The anonymous letter had been an act of trust. The 7 repayments had been 7 more, and the fund's continuation, year after year, through the rest of Bumpy Johnson's life, had been thousands of smaller acts of the same kind. People deciding to notice, deciding to care, deciding to move money from where it was to where it needed to be, without announcement and without expectation of recognition. The envelope in the drawer had no signature. The fund had no name. The 7 debts had been paid without public record. These absences were not failures of documentation. They were the documentation evidence that something had worked exactly as it was supposed to, quietly and completely, without requiring the validation of anyone who hadn't been part of it. That was enough. In Bumpy Johnson's accounting, which was particular about what counted as enough and what didn't, that was precisely enough.